Book 1. The Boy and the Indian. Chapter 1. A Strange Meeting. When I was a boy in 1924, began my father, I used to walk from my house in Throg's Neck to the woody hills of Hunter and Twin Islands as often as I could. That area fascinated me because it contained almost all the flora and fauna that I had read about in my Boy Scout manuals. I found both glacial boulders and scratches, evidence of the great ice sheet that had descended on the Bronx from the north. I picked and ate berries and fruits of varieties my mother never saw in stores. The rocky shores provided me with ample specimens for my geology studies. Fresh water ran from several springs on the islands, and so I could be self-sufficient for a day, without even bringing along a lunch or canteen. There was no Orchard Beach here yet to attract people in any number, and often I could spend an entire day walking field and shore without seeing another person. I had no idea then that the reverse was seldom true. When a bush would quiver without a breeze to prod it, I would dismiss it as a small animal frightened by my intrusion into this solitude. For many months I was quite unaware that I was being watched. Then one day I discovered a rabbit run in the underbrush. It was heavily tamped down, indicating the passage of many little feet. I decided to follow it and see if I could stalk up to a cottontail and touch him. I had touched a deer that way once at the Boy Scout camp upstate. For a while it was easy going as I followed through the low brush. But as I went along it became heavier. Soon I was on all fours, crawling under blackberry brambles and thick bushes. A few feet ahead, a cut branch caught my eye, and I went over to take a closer look. The cut wood was all that showed of a very ingenious noose snare, made entirely of wood and bark strips. During the following months, alerted by the snare I had found, I quietly noticed other signs of possible habitation in my woodland retreat. The possibility that someone could live here, unobserved by even so regular a visitor as myself, was intriguing. I continued my observation through the summer and into the early fall. I was studying the animal life and the botanical and geological portions in preparation for several merit badges I wanted for my scouting efforts. And I always looked, as well, for the person I now knew to be there, but I could never find him. One morning in early October of that year, I was on Twin Island. As I walked toward the glacial boulder called Lion Rock, a figure stepped from behind it into my view. He stood and looked at me for what seemed quite a long time before he said, "Good day, I am Joe." I remember thinking, even after those few words, that he had a foreign accent of a sort I had never heard. How mistaken I was. That accent was only foreign to my ears. It was anything else but that to this land of oak trees and blackberries. I didn't know it yet, but I was speaking to a true American, an Algonquin Indian. The second thing that Joe said was, "I know you very much. You watch all the living things, but you do not harm them. Why?" I tried to explain to him about my interest in natural history and my scouting merit badges, but I think he didn't understand all of it. At some point in our conversation, he decided that scouting was like being Indian. When that concept had formed in his mind, he seemed more at ease with me. Finally, He told me he hoped I would have my merit badges, and he left me to lean on the lion rock and wonder. As he walked away, I noticed several things about him. His long gray hair and wrinkled face plainly showed great age, but his posture was straight, almost military, with shoulders held stiffly. He was quite tall, perhaps 6 feet, and lean to the point of boniness. Over his gaunt frame hung a patchwork of clothes made from fur, cloth, and leather. After that day, Joe no longer hid from me, and he would often accompany me on my forays. His knowledge of the woods around us was phenomenal, but he was often confused by my words. If I asked him to show me the heron, he would shrug as if to say, "Such words are not mine." But if I asked him for the fishing bird with a long neck and pointed beak, he would smile and off we'd go. In terms of a modern naturalist, he knew hardly any of the creatures' names. In terms of their lives in hidden places, he knew them all as neighbors. They were his actual lifelong neighbors, for he had lived here all of his days except for a few years during which he tried unsuccessfully to adapt to the life of New York City and other white man's places. Joe never actually told me he was an Indian. He seemed to think I should know it automatically, gradually, and that is exactly what happened. I knew. The realization crept up on me over a period of months, and finally it was there. I was aware that Joe was an Indian, and somehow the knowledge did not seem surprising. We had become friends during that winter, and when he saw that I had guessed his origins and was still not a threat, he asked if I would hear his story so that it would not die when he went to the Great Spirit. Since all his people were gone now, he knew that when his bones were in the ground, no one would be left to speak of him or of his deeds during the storytelling time of future winters. He warned me sternly that Teachee Manitou, maker of all things, is very strict about the telling of stories. If I ever told a story after he was gone, said Joe, it must only be in the winter. Otherwise, the maker would become angry with me for interrupting the time when his people should fish and plant and put aside food for the long winter. The cold season was the correct time for telling stories. He took a long time to explain to me the importance of his story. He told me that by itself it was only the history of his life, which had not been as great with war deeds and valor as past braves. The importance, he said, was in the fact that only when no one knew his story, only when no one was left to tell it at the campfire of winter, would he be truly gone. As long as one person could still tell the tale, Two Trees, for that was his Algonquin name, would still live in the rocks and trees that had been his home. He asked if I would visit his home, and naturally I agreed. We set off at a brisk walk across Hunter Island to a spot near one of the clear springs that had given me water on many a summer day. Joe said, "Here we are." I looked, but saw nothing to indicate a house or any sort of habitation. Joe walked to a very thick, brushy wall that consisted of poison ivy, thorn bushes, and ropey vines of Virginia creeper, and seemed to melt right through the tangled barrier. Although I hadn't been able to see it, there was an entranceway. Once I had passed through, I looked around and saw that the foliage formed a roughly circular barrier wall about 50 or 60 feet in diameter. One side of the clearing had been cultivated into neat piles of earth, and a gigantic corn stalk grew from each pile. Between the corn, at ground level, creepers spread in all directions. At intervals along these vines, large squash peeked out of the broad leaves. The other half of the tiny circle held dozens of small poles, and beans were evident in the many green pods that hung down from the covering vines. Tomato plants also had a small patch devoted to their yellow flowers and greenish fruits. Directly across from the hidden entrance stood a low bark hut or shelter. Its frame was made of bent saplings, and its covering was a combination of woven reeds, mud, and slabs of elm bark. It looked long enough for a man to lie at full length in, but barely. Along one wall of the structure, many fruits and vegetables were cut open and spread out to dry in the sun. The size of the plants and their fruits was such that I asked Joe how he got them to grow so large. My father grew many of these in our home garden patch, with fertilizers and insect powders, but his were never so perfect. Joe told me the heads and entrails of all fish that he caught were used to enrich the soil of his small plot. Plenty of water from the nearby spring was carted up to keep the soil moist, and the maker's son did the rest. Joe explained how he kept his small farm free of pests. The Indian form of insect control was fascinating, and maybe modern farmers would do well to use a bit less poison and a few more of these earlier tricks. Joe said that each fall, when the leaves had dropped, he would walk among the blackberry and alder patches. Here he found the egg cases of the praying mantis. He would collect as many as he could find and place them at intervals around his compound. In spring, when his crops were beginning to grow, hordes of hungry mantises would hatch out to eat the young beetles bent on devouring leaves and vegetables. A side benefit for Joe was that the growing predators would eat flies and mosquitoes all summer long as well. Joe had found that the orange and black beetle we call ladybug was not very appetizing to the praying mantis. They, however, were fond of eating the tiny aphids that sucked the juices from the tomato plants. When he found the ladybug in his travels, he would carefully place it in his belt pouch and bring it home. The tiny bug was then placed on a tomato plant to eat heartily of the little aphids. Here was a man who had created an ecological balance in his surroundings long before ecology became a fashionable word. The maximum use of all things within a framework of no waste was something Joe did as his ancestors had for thousands of years. He lived this way, apparently, for no other reason than that it made good sense. As I looked around the small home site, I was struck by the strange mixture of 20th century and Stone Age artifacts that stood here and there, ready for use. A rusted and broken shovel leaned against a low rock, and beside it was a stone hoe lashed to a hickory handle with strips of bark. On the overhanging branch of a tree hung a long pole with a carefully carved bone head. The tip had many barbs, and was evidently a fish spear. Near some empty tin cans, probably scavenged from the shoreline, and a battered cast-iron pot, stood a cooking vessel made of clay. It looked just like the ones I had seen in the Indian exhibit at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. I told this to Joe. I guess he saw the interest that the clay pot had aroused in me, and his next question came as something of a surprise. "You want to make one? I help you." So it was that the first Indian project in what was to become a long list was undertaken by a young white boy, long after the original race was gone. Almost. I had already learned that Joe held magical meanings and spiritual concepts very important, but his explanation of the making of a simple pot was astounding. He told me that this making must first begin in the heart or soul, for that was the place the maker started all good ideas. Once the young thought had ripened, like a fruit on its branch, it would follow a natural course to the head. The brain, he said, was the second stopping place for any plan. It was in the brain that Teachee Manitou would come during sleep time to help the plan become a workable project. In short, once the new idea had been prayed over, thought about, and then slept on, it was time to bring it into the world as a reality. I was told to go home and pray that my pot would be made well, and that once made, it would be full whenever I or my family was hungry. Joe Two Trees wasn't very particular about who I prayed to, since he seemed quite certain that my prayers would find their way to the appropriate authority, even if I called him by some name he didn't know. I undertook the making of my pot as I had been instructed, and the old man's sincerity made me feel it was really the only course of action I could take. Anyway, I thought, a prayer for a full family cooking pot could hardly be a wasted one.